Clayton Kershaw had one question. Not a demand. Not a negotiation. Not the calculated positioning of a veteran pitcher protecting his legacy in the final chapter of a Hall of Fame career. Just one quiet, almost disbelieving question, directed at the people around him when the request first reached him. Do you know? 2 words. But the way Kershaw said them, the pause before them, the quality of the silence after them, told everyone in earshot exactly what he meant. Do you know what you are asking me to do? Do you know what it means to stand 60 feet and 6 inches away from Shohei Ohtani in a World Baseball Classic, representing the United States, with everything that moment carries? Do you know that I have faced the best hitters in the world for nearly 2 decades and that none of them, not one, compares to what Ohtani has become? Do you know? And then, before anyone could answer, Kershaw did something that nobody predicted. Something that traveled through the baseball world like a current and produced a reaction in Japan that nobody in America fully anticipated. He said yes. Not reluctantly. Not after careful deliberation and contractual negotiation and assurances about his workload and his preparation timeline. He said yes the way a man says yes when he has been waiting for a question his whole career without knowing it. And across an entire nation, watching from thousands of miles away, something that can only be described as collective pride rose up in response, not just for Ohtani, who had inspired the request, but for Kershaw, who had answered it with a grace that reminded everyone why he had always been something more than just an elite pitcher. The story of how that request was made, why Kershaw responded the way he did, and what the moment between these 2 former Dodger teammates revealed about both men, this is that story. To understand why Kershaw's response shocked the baseball world, you first have to understand the nature of the request itself. The WBC selection process for the United States roster is, on paper, a logistical exercise. Coaches and front office personnel identify available players, assess fitness and willingness, and construct a roster that balances star power with tactical versatility. It is organized, professional, and largely conducted through the formal channels of player representation and team coordination. But sometimes, inside that process, something less formal happens. The request to include Kershaw, and specifically the framing of that request, the way it was presented not merely as a roster decision but as a direct response to the presence of Shohei Ohtani on the opposing Japanese squad, came from a place that surprised people inside the selection process. It came, according to those familiar with the situation, from a genuine desire to create the confrontation. Not for spectacle. Not for television ratings or marketing narratives. But because the people who understood both players, who had watched both careers from close proximity, believed that a Kershaw versus Ohtani moment in a WBC setting was something the sport deserved. Something that honored the history of both men and the significance of the tournament itself. When the request reached Kershaw, it was framed with complete honesty. There was no softening of what was being asked. He was being asked to step into one of the most pressure-saturated environments in international baseball, past the age when most pitchers of his caliber would consider such exposure, specifically because the other team had Shohei Ohtani. The messenger, by all accounts, held nothing back. And Kershaw, who had spent his entire career defined by the willingness to accept exactly this kind of challenge, listened to every word. Then he asked his question. Do you know? The American sports media covered the Kershaw-Ohtani dynamic primarily through the lens of competition. Former teammates, now opposing forces in an international tournament. The narrative wrote itself cleanly and dramatically, and most coverage stopped there. But the relationship between these 2 men is considerably more textured than that framing suggests. And understanding the texture is essential to understanding why Kershaw's response landed the way it did, particularly in Japan, where the reaction carried a depth of feeling that went far beyond appreciation for a good baseball story. Kershaw and Ohtani shared a Dodgers clubhouse during a period that was, for both of them, professionally significant in different ways. For Kershaw, it was the continuation of a legendary career in its mature phase, a time of careful management, hard-won wisdom, and the particular kind of leadership that comes from a player who has seen everything the game can show and chosen to remain present anyway. For Ohtani, it was the beginning of his American chapter, the translation of a uniquely Japanese baseball phenomenon into a context that had never fully existed before. What players who observed their dynamic during that period describe is not a mentor-student relationship. It is something more mutual than that. Kershaw, who has never been given to easy praise or performed admiration, watched Ohtani with the quiet attention of a craftsman recognizing something he had never encountered before. Not just the ability, the approach. The commitment. The complete absence of ego in how Ohtani went about becoming better every single day. And Ohtani, in turn, absorbed what Kershaw represented. Not technique specifically, though there was learning in that direction too. What Ohtani absorbed was the model of a career, the proof that longevity at the highest level was not accidental but chosen, daily, through the accumulation of decisions that most people find too demanding to sustain. They were, in the truest sense, professional mirrors for each other. Each one reflecting back something the other needed to see. Which is why the WBC request carried the weight it did. And why Kershaw's answer mattered so much. Before going further, it is necessary to address the label that had attached itself to Kershaw in the period leading up to the WBC discussions. The Ohtani killer. In baseball media, particularly in the analytics-driven corners of American coverage, the term had emerged from a specific body of evidence. Kershaw's numbers against Ohtani in their head-to-head matchups were, by the standards of what Ohtani does to most pitchers, unusually favorable to the pitcher. Ohtani had not punished Kershaw the way he punished others. The matchup, statistically, tilted in a direction that almost no other elite pitcher could claim. The label was meant as praise. As evidence of Kershaw's continued relevance against the best competition the sport offered. But Kershaw himself, when the label reached him, responded with characteristic directness. He did not embrace it. He did not use it as evidence that the WBC request was manageable or that the confrontation held less danger than others imagined. And that difference, Kershaw made clear, was precisely why the request was significant and precisely why his answer was yes. He did not want to face a diminished Ohtani. He did not want the version of Ohtani who was managing a long season across 162 games with a dozen other priorities competing for his attention. He wanted the WBC version. The version that Japan sent when the whole country needed someone to carry them. That was the Ohtani worth facing. And Kershaw intended to face him. When word of Kershaw's response spread in Japan, the reaction surprised the American journalists and analysts who had been covering the WBC build-up primarily as a domestic sports story. The praise that erupted across Japanese baseball media and social platforms was not simply appreciation for a competitive narrative. It was something more culturally specific, rooted in values that Japanese baseball culture holds with unusual seriousness. In Japan, the willingness to face the best, not to avoid them, not to manage around them, not to protect your legacy by limiting your exposure to the moments where failure is most possible, is considered one of the highest expressions of athletic character. The concept carries a weight in Japanese sporting culture that does not translate directly into the American framework, where protecting statistics and managing risk are considered rational professional decisions rather than failures of courage. Kershaw saying yes, not just yes, but yes with full knowledge of what he was saying yes to, was read in Japan through this lens. He was not being reckless. He was not performing bravado for an audience. He was making the choice that Japanese baseball culture recognizes immediately and respects completely, the choice to test yourself against the best available test, regardless of the outcome. Sports commentators in Japan spoke about Kershaw in language usually reserved for Japanese athletes being praised for their own competitive spirit. Television panels that analyzed the WBC build-up devoted extended segments not to Kershaw's statistics or preparation, but to what his response communicated about who he was as a competitor and as a person. Several former Japanese national team players, speaking publicly, drew direct comparisons between Kershaw's response and the mentality that Ohtani himself had always modeled. The willingness to seek the hardest challenge rather than the most comfortable path. The praise, in other words, was not for Kershaw the pitcher. It was for Kershaw the competitor. For the choice he made when given the option to choose differently. Inside the United States preparation camp, Kershaw's confirmation sent a ripple through the squad that coaches and support staff described as significant. When a player of Kershaw's stature and career history makes a decision that is visibly motivated not by personal statistics or professional safety but by competitive desire, it changes the atmosphere around him. Other players watch. They calibrate. They ask themselves whether their own approach to the tournament measures up to the standard being set by the veteran in the room. Several members of the U.S. roster, speaking in the build-up period, referenced Kershaw's commitment in ways that suggested it had influenced their own. Not through any speech he gave. Not through any formal leadership moment that could be pointed to and quoted. Simply through the example of the decision itself. This is the same mechanism that Ohtani's presence creates in every team environment he occupies. The standard does not need to be verbalized to be felt. It only needs to exist, visibly and consistently, and the people around it will calibrate toward it whether they consciously intend to or not. Kershaw and Ohtani, approaching the same tournament from opposite sides of it, were already doing something to the competition before a single pitch had been thrown. They were raising the meaning of the whole thing. And the players on both rosters could feel it. There is a particular kind of anticipation that builds around sporting confrontations that feel genuinely historic. Not manufactured. Not the product of promotional campaigns or media narratives constructed to drive viewership. The real kind, the kind that comes from two competitors whose careers and characters have been building toward a specific moment for years. Kershaw versus Ohtani in a WBC setting carried that quality from the moment it became possible. Two men who had shared a clubhouse and absorbed something from each other during that proximity. Two careers defined by the refusal to accept anything less than complete commitment to the craft. Two competitors who, when presented with the hardest available challenge, had each independently made the same choice, toward it, not away from it. The confrontation, whenever it came, whenever Kershaw took the mound and Ohtani stepped into the box in a setting where everything was real and nothing was managed and the result would stand forever in the record of what happened, would be the kind of baseball moment that the sport produces rarely and that fans remember for the rest of their lives. Not because of what the statistics would show afterward. But because of what it meant for two men of that character and that career to stand across from each other in that arena. Kershaw knew it. That was what the question meant. Do you know what you are asking? I know exactly what I am asking, came the implicit reply. That is why I am asking it. And Kershaw's yes had made it real. Step back from the tournament, from the roster decisions and the tactical analysis and the head-to-head statistics, and look at what this story is actually about. It is about two competitors, at different stages of extraordinary careers, choosing the same value at a moment when choosing differently would have been easier and safer and entirely defensible. Kershaw did not need the WBC. He did not need the exposure, the risk, the possibility of a headline that read, "Ohtani destroys Kershaw in WBC final," appearing in every sports publication on earth. He had nothing left to prove to anyone who understood baseball. But that, precisely, is why his yes mattered. It was not a yes made from a position of need. It was a yes made from a position of choice, the purest kind. The kind that says this is what I believe competition is for. This is what the craft deserves. This is how I want to be remembered, not as someone who protected his numbers, but as someone who showed up for the hardest version of the game every time it was offered. And Ohtani, on the other side of that choice, understood it completely. Because it was the same choice he had been making his entire career. Somewhere, in the history of this sport, there will be a record of what happened when Kershaw and Ohtani finally stood across from each other on that international stage. Wins and losses. Pitches thrown. Results documented in the permanent language of baseball statistics. But the real record was written before any of that. It was written the moment Kershaw heard the request, paused, asked his question, and then gave his answer. 2 words asked what the stakes were. 1 word accepted them completely. And a nation, watching from the other side of the world, understanding something about that choice that needed no translation, responded with something it rarely offers to an opposing player. Genuine, unqualified respect. Do you think Kershaw can handle WBC Ohtani, the version playing for his country with everything on the line? Tell us what you think in the comments below.